The bear stood in the clearing, its massive frame hunched and trembling under the weight of exhaustion. Each breath it drew was strained, rasping through the still morning air as if life itself had become too heavy to carry. Its fur, once thick and commanding, now hung in damp, tangled clumps around a grotesque swelling near its lower abdomen. The wound pulsed with infection, red and raw, seeping fluid that drew a cloud of flies to its surface. The animal remained still, not from peace or trust, but from a quiet surrender that only comes when the fight has long since drained away. Overhead, a drone silently hovered, its camera zooming in on the motionless figure. Rangers watching from a distance didn't speak. They didn't need to. What they saw was more than just an injured creature. The stillness, the weight of the bear's posture, the eerie calm that clung to the forest clearing, it all pointed to something deeper. This was no fresh injury. This was a wound aged with time and burden, layered with untold pain. And though they couldn't yet know its origin, the truth was waiting just beneath the surface. Because the damage wasn't just physical. It was part of a story the bear had carried for years, a silent testimony of survival written into every scar, every step, every breath. The first signs came quietly, almost unnoticed amid the routine footage that streamed daily into the ranger station. 2 days before the bear was found collapsed in the clearing, Ranger Michael had been reviewing surveillance feeds from motion-triggered cameras placed throughout the sanctuary. What caught his attention was a peculiar repetition. A single bear, unusually large and likely female, pacing the same patch of land again and again. Her movements were uneven, one hind leg dragging slightly as she circled a grove of trees without purpose or direction. In normal conditions, such behavior might hint at nesting or the presence of cubs, but this bear was always alone. There was no den, no signs of young, only an endless, silent orbit that hinted at something deeply wrong. Curious and increasingly uneasy, Michael took to the field, retracing her path and examining the trees she had passed. That's when he saw the claw marks, not the wide, vertical slashes of territorial display, but wild, disorganized scratches, gouged into bark at erratic angles. These weren't warnings to other animals. They were signs of panic. With growing concern, he ordered a thermal drone sweep of the area. The images returned confirmed his fears. The bear's belly was grotesquely distended, her body visibly deteriorating. The swelling looked unnatural, possibly infected, possibly worse. Every moment of delay seemed to carry weight. Michael understood a brutal truth known to those who work closely with wildlife. Bears are fiercely solitary and defensive. If one allowed humans near, it was never out of trust. It was because they had no fight left in them. That grim reality settled like a shadow across the ranger's chest. Time was slipping away, and if they didn't act soon, they wouldn't be helping a bear recover. They'd be recovering a body. Catching a wild bear isn't just about science or skill. It's about understanding the fragile line between survival and surrender. When the decision was made to intervene, the team knew they had one chance. Anything aggressive or loud could drive her deeper into the wilderness, where her condition would only worsen. They chose a humane trap, reinforced yet unthreatening, and carefully disguised it in the landscape she had already claimed. Honey was smeared across the floor of the enclosure, and the scent of fresh salmon oil soaked into tufts of moss placed nearby. The smell would drift with the wind, carried through the pines to where she wandered in hunger. Cameras were positioned at all angles, transmitting live footage back to the base. Then, all they could do was wait. Hours passed. Day turned to night. The bait sat untouched. Hope began to fade as the rangers silently watched shadows stretch across the clearing. Then, as dusk approached and the air cooled, she appeared. Her body moved slowly, every step labored. She didn't approach directly, instead circling at a distance, sniffing the air with guarded caution. Minutes felt like hours as she lingered on the edge. Then, hunger pulled her forward. With one final glance toward the trees behind her, she stepped inside. The gate dropped behind her, not with a crash, but with a careful, padded close. There was no panic, no thrashing, just silence. When the team arrived moments later with tranquilizer gear, they found her standing still. She didn't growl or rear back. She only stared. Her eyes, sunken and rimmed with exhaustion, held no fight, just a haunting dullness that seemed to speak of wounds far deeper than flesh. That look, heavy with resignation, marked the beginning of something far beyond rescue. It was the first step in uncovering a truth no one was prepared to face. Inside the wildlife medical facility, a calm urgency filled the room. The team of specialists moved with quiet coordination, each one aware that every passing second carried weight. The bear, now sedated and lying heavily on a reinforced examination table, breathed in slow, shallow rhythms. Tubes were inserted to stabilize her. Blood was drawn. Her heart rate, low but steady, thudded softly through the monitor. As they began to gently shave the matted fur around the grotesque swelling on her abdomen, what lay beneath the surface began to tell a different story, one far more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. The skin around the abscess was inflamed, but not freshly so. As the fur fell away, the veterinarians paused. Just beneath the surface, caught in layers of hardened tissue, were tiny, irregular fragments of metal. Some were rusted, others thin and sharp-edged like shrapnel. They hadn't entered her body recently. The tissue had long since grown around them, creating pockets of infection and pressure. It was clear that the wound had not been caused by another animal. This wasn't a bite or a claw injury. This was man-made, and it had festered over time in silence and suffering. As they continued examining her, more signs appeared. Along her lower flank, hidden beneath the dense fur, were several scars, clean, evenly spaced, and parallel. Not jagged or wild like those from a territorial fight. These were surgical, controlled, and old. Their placement suggested incisions. Someone, at some point in this bear's life, had operated on her. Or worse, experimented. But there were no records, no tags, no microchips, just the evidence carved into her body, of something done long ago, then abandoned. The room grew quiet as the implications sank in. This was not just a wild bear with a medical emergency. She was a living mystery, a survivor of something sinister. Whatever had been done to her had been buried in her silence, left to rot beneath her skin until now. And the most horrifying truth was that the people who had once handled her had done so without care, without regard, without love. They had left her with a wound she was never meant to survive. Investigations began almost immediately. The medical team and sanctuary officials scoured every database they had access to, looking for any trace of the bear's past. Wildlife registries, zoo transfer logs, sanctuary intake records, anything that might explain where she had come from and what had been done to her. But nothing matched. No active facility reported a missing or released female grizzly of her size and age. No government database held her tag. For a moment, it seemed as though she had appeared from nowhere, a ghost of the wild with a story no one could trace. Then one ranger unearthed a forgotten report from nearly 5 years ago. It detailed the forced closure of a roadside attraction located over 120 miles from the sanctuary. The operation had been shut down for serious animal welfare violations. Words like unlicensed, unsanitary, and dangerous containment practices filled the pages. Several animals had been confiscated and relocated to proper care facilities, but some had gone unaccounted for. The final note in the file listed them simply as missing. At the time, officials had assumed those animals hadn't survived. Captivity conditions had left them weak, disoriented, and unfit for the wild. But now that assumption came under doubt. Perhaps one had survived after all. Perhaps she had escaped not just the physical walls of a cage, but the memory of it, wandering into the wilderness in search of something she barely understood. As the reality took shape, a heavy silence settled over the team. This was no longer just a case of medical intervention. It was something far darker. A living relic of cruelty had stumbled into their care, carrying within her the physical remnants of an experience she had never chosen. She wasn't dying from age or accident. She was dying from a wound left behind by the hands of humans. The operating room, though sterile and prepared, felt anything but routine. Every person in the space understood that what lay before them was no ordinary case. The bear's body, stretched across the reinforced surgical table, bore the weight not only of physical damage, but of a history written in silence and scar tissue. The medical team began with precision, draining the abscess first, releasing a flood of infected fluid that spoke to months, possibly years, of untreated trauma. The smell was sharp, the tissue fragile, and every motion required patience. With steady hands and magnified lenses, they began the painstaking task of extracting the metal shards lodged deep beneath her skin. Some were embedded in muscle, fused to tissue as if her body had tried to absorb the foreign invaders in an attempt to survive. Others sat dangerously close to internal organs, where a single slip could have been fatal. Hours passed. The rhythm of heart monitors provided the only backdrop as concentration filled the room. Then, without warning, her heartbeat faltered. A sharp beep, a sudden flatline, and the entire room froze. For a few terrible seconds, it felt as though her story was ending right there. But emergency intervention brought her back. Slowly, her vitals returned. Her body, though battered and broken, refused to give in. There was something inside her that still wanted to live, something primal and persistent, holding on with quiet, relentless strength. By the time the final sutures were placed, no one spoke. The exhaustion in the room was heavy, but so was the reverence. What they had done was more than a medical procedure. They had given a second chance to a creature that had once been discarded. She was documented, photographed, and tagged for tracking, but not before they gave her a name. Ashka, a word that had once belonged to the land's first protectors. It meant hope, and as she was gently moved to a secluded recovery enclosure, it seemed fitting, because in her survival, in her fight to endure despite everything that had been taken from her, she had become more than a patient. Ashka was now a symbol of resilience, of healing, and of the quiet power to begin again. In the first few days following her surgery, Ashka lay still for hours at a time, her body conserving every ounce of energy it had left. Her breathing remained shallow, her eyes closed more often than not, and food offered to her went mostly untouched. Caretakers monitored her around the clock, noting every rise and fall of her chest, every tentative twitch of her limbs. The path to healing was uncertain, but hope lingered quietly in the corners of her enclosure. On the 6th day, something changed. Ashka stood, slowly, shakily, but with undeniable intent. The act itself, simple as it was, felt monumental. A creature that had been buried in pain was now lifting herself out of it. By the 10th day, she began to explore the boundary of her space. Though still wary, she approached the fence when caretakers arrived. There was no aggression in her movements, only a calm curiosity that deepened with each passing visit. They never touched her. There was no need to. Their presence became part of her routine, and they honored her silence. In those quiet moments, something remarkable happened. The scars on her body, now emerging through patches of regrowing fur, stood clear in the sunlight. They weren't hidden, and perhaps they never would be. But they no longer looked like wounds. They looked like chapters. The staff often spoke of the way she stared, direct, unwavering. She didn't look at them with the wild distrust of an untamed animal, nor did she gaze with gratitude. Her look was something different, a kind of recognition, as though she understood, in some way, what had been done and what was being undone. It was the look of a survivor who had not only endured but had chosen, in the quiet sanctuary of her new world, to keep going. Weeks turned into quiet chapters of strength regained. Under careful observation, and within the peaceful safety of her enclosure, Ashka's transformation was nothing short of extraordinary. What had once been a fragile shell of a wounded bear was now a creature pulsing with renewed vitality. Her movements became fluid, her appetite returned, and her once lifeless eyes took on a steady focus. Every action she made seemed to reclaim a part of the wild she had once been torn from. Trail cameras captured her testing the limits of her enclosure, climbing thick tree trunks, turning over logs in search of insects, submerging herself in water as though remembering how it felt to move freely. She wasn't just recovering. She was preparing. The decision was made in quiet agreement. Ashka was ready, and more importantly, she deserved to return to the wild she had survived for so long without help. On the morning of her release, the air was thick with mist, and the forest beyond the sanctuary stood still, as if waiting. Her crate was positioned at the edge of a ridge that opened into endless green. When the door slid open, there was no panic, no rush. Ashka remained still for a long moment, breathing in the familiar sense of the world she once knew. Then, without urgency or fear, she stepped out. Her pace was steady, her path clear. She didn't glance back at the people who had helped her heal. She didn't need to. But just before she disappeared over the rise, she paused. The wind moved gently through the trees. Slowly, she turned her head, looking back not as a captive leaving her cage, but as a being returning to her rightful place. One silent moment of acknowledgement, and then she was gone, swallowed by the forest that had always waited for her. The seasons turned quietly in the highland forest. Winter swept in with its hush of snow and silence, erasing the memory of footsteps and fading the trails once traveled. The world seemed still, as if holding its breath. Then spring arrived, soft and tentative at first, breathing life back into the trees and stirring movement beneath the thawing ground. It was during one of the early patrols of the season that rangers found something unexpected near the same ridge where Ashka had disappeared months earlier. In the fresh mud beside a stream, two distinct sets of tracks emerged. One was broad and heavy, unmistakably from an adult bear. The other was smaller, lighter, just a fraction of the first in size. A cub. The discovery sent a quiet ripple through the sanctuary team. They reviewed camera footage, scanning hours of movement from hidden lenses placed along the bordering woods. Eventually, they found her, distant, silhouetted against the low sun. A large bear moved through the trees with unhurried grace, and beside her, a smaller figure followed closely, mimicking each step. The images were grainy, and the distance too great for confirmation, but those who had cared for Ashka knew. It was the way she carried herself, the rhythm of her walk, the familiarity in her posture. It felt like recognition. They couldn't prove it. They didn't need to. Deep down, the belief settled in like truth. Ashka hadn't just survived. She had returned to the wild, claimed her space, and found connection where there had once been only loneliness. Perhaps, against all odds, she had even become a mother. And in that quiet corner of the forest, the story of her pain had given way to something new, something living, breathing, and sacred. A continuation, a legacy born not from captivity, but from freedom reclaimed. In a world where the suffering of the silent often goes unseen, Ashka's journey stands as a quiet testament to resilience. Hers was not a story shaped by spectacle or attention, but by survival born in the shadows, carved through years of pain endured without witness. From the moment she staggered into that clearing to the day she disappeared into the forest once more, her life traced a path few could understand, but many would come to revere. She reminded us that healing is not always loud, and strength is not always visible in muscle or might. Sometimes it lives in stillness, in the breath that continues, when every reason not to has already come and gone. Ashka did not carry her scars as burdens. They were not marks of pity, but banners of endurance. They spoke of nights survived alone, of pain endured in silence, of cruelty that never stole her will to keep walking. What had been done to her could not be undone, but it did not define her. She chose what came next. She rose from a place of unimaginable hardship, not only to reclaim her life, but to shape it anew, on her own terms, in her own space, under no one's control. And in the quiet corners of the forest, far from roads and cages and names, Ashka now lives as she was always meant to, unclaimed, unbroken, and undeniably free. Her legacy is not one of victimhood, but of victory. She reminds us that even in a world where instinct often silences mercy, there are those who rise anyway, not for recognition, not for applause, but simply because something deep within them refuses to give up. And that, in its purest form, is the wild's most sacred truth. If this story touched something within you, consider subscribing to our channel. Here, we share real stories that often go unheard, stories where the wild and the human spirit cross paths not through dominance, but through understanding and compassion. These are the quiet narratives that unfold far from the noise of headlines, told not in words, but in the silent strength of survival. Every like, comment, and share allows us to keep bringing these powerful moments to light. Moments where animals show us the rawest form of resilience, and where healing takes place not in hospitals, but in the heart of the wild. Ashka's story is just one of many, and through your support, we can continue to honor those who cannot speak for themselves, but whose lives are no less remarkable. Until we meet again, stay kind, stay curious, and never stop believing in the strength that rises in silence, the courage that endures without applause, and the miracles that happen when survival becomes a story of hope.